Good evening, students. Welcome to Week 8, Globalization, Mission, and Ministry. Again, we're still in the response of the church. And today this week, we're looking at public theology. So we've been talking for a while in this class about the need for a moral ecosystem, a moral and philosophic architecture to facilitate international collaboration. And of course, Zakaria talks about that, Zheng Liang and Yu Gang talk about that, Myers talks about that, that negotiated common interest can only get you so far. It's essential, and sometimes it works, but even when a particular action is in the long-term interests of everyone, the truth is that politicians are dependent on short-term approval. And so it can be very difficult for them to actually focus on long-term interests that might cost them their short-term approval. So we need something more if something more is possible. And of course, sometimes it is possible that common values have historically resulted in common action. Just think about the refugee crisis after World War II, that there really was an international coming together that really had a moral foundation as well as a foundation of negotiated common interest. And you can see a picture right there from after World War II of refugees, just to sort of bring it home. Of course, we also believe as Christians that this sense that there is a moral ecosystem, that there is a moral and philosophical architecture, if we were only able to articulate it, is baked into each of us as human beings made in the image of God. Often the political theologians talk about the covenant with Noah, that not all of us share the covenant of Abraham, but we all share the covenant with Noah. And the Catholics, of course, talk about this as natural law, that they work off of Romans 1 and some other verses in Scripture, and talk about how natural law is baked into all of us. And therefore, we hunger for this. We hunger for a moral ecosystem and a moral and philosophic architecture. But why public theology? How do we get from a moral ecosystem and a moral and philosophic architecture to public theology? Well, the Lutheran theologian, Martin Marty, was the first person to use this phrase, public theology. And what he meant by it in 1974 was the contribution of the Christian faith to church, society, and state. So what do we contribute as Christians to the public arena? Our own Sebastian Kim at Fuller has a very cogent way of describing what public theology is. He says, public theology is Christian theology that talks with society, not to society. And Bryant Myers would say that this isn't just good to attempt for the sake of the world. It's also something that we need because we live in a world of competing globalisms, and they impact us, they poison us. So even for our own sake, we need a thoughtful response to these competing globalisms. And of course, since our mission is contested in this world, part of apologetics is having that thoughtful response. So we need a public theology, even if nobody else listens to us. But of course, the question is, which public theology? Both Max Stackhouse and Daniel Rudy say that public theology needs to be interfaith, whereas Bryant Myers and Justin Thacker believe that it needs to be Christian. Of course, when you say it needs to be Christian, what kind of Christian? Is it Catholic? Is it Protestant? Is it general? Can the world take the secular aspects or aspects which can be translated into secular terms of our public theology, or are we trying to get them to take the whole thing? So those are all very important questions. However, regardless, there are some common elements in public theology as it has been proposed to date. So I just want to share some of the common elements. Again, I'm just framing. You have all the details in the literature you're reading. So one common element is a proposal for a different kind of anthropology based in the belief that all human beings are made in the image of God. So the implications of believing that are that every person, there's the absolute value of each human being and each human life. And there's also a human right to agency, that we are not fully human and we're not fully valued if we're not free to create and to make decisions about our own lives. But biblical anthropology, part of a public theology, also talks about human sin, individual sin and collective sin. And of course, the implications for believing in sin is that it's not possible to achieve utopian goals. So our goals always have to happen in the context of a balance of powers and a variety of perspectives. So it supports a democratic approach. Then, secondly, another common element is that we don't believe that power has the right to do whatever it wants just because it can. That we believe that all power is accountable to the people and to God, and is also responsible. So to talk about sins of omission as well as sins of commission are part of this belief in transcendence, that we don't own power in the end, but we are accountable for our power. And then thirdly, what is the ultimate goal of all of our collaborative efforts? That public theology describes that goal as a redeemed community in right relationship. And Thacker talks about that as the corporate image of God. Now, of course, I want to go back just for a minute. Oh, I can't. This thing doesn't go back. Anyhow, you saw the little picture, I think, of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in that last slide. I am giving you a video on YouTube of his most famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech. Martin Luther King Jr. is an exemplar of public theology. So I want you to, as you see that speech, to think about it, to think about what are the elements of a public theology, because they're all present in that speech. So, do you see the elements that I just described, and how are they present? However, the most organized and widespread and popular form around the world of public theology is Catholic social teaching. Of course, this is Pope Francis. And there are 6 elements to Catholic social teaching, although they are interpreted in different ways by different Catholics. So there's a truth about God and people, that would be the anthropological element. Human dignity, that's rooted in the image of God, all people being made in the image of God. Common good, we are all connected and we seek for what is good for all of us, not only what is good for each of us, and we trust that what is good for all of us is good for each of us. Subsidiarity talks about human freedom and agency. Solidarity talks about what it means to live conscious of our common connection. And the option for the poor recognizes that unless we center the poor, we actually will never care equally for each other in the way that we need to live out the common good and solidarity. So this is all well and good. But how does it work? How does our public theology actually facilitate international collaboration? Can it possibly do that? So the picture on this slide is Wilberforce, and he was one of the leaders who was responsible for the ending of slavery as an institution in North America and in Britain. And in Britain, there wasn't a civil war involved with it. In the U.S., of course, there was. But he really did proclaim he was one of the main leaders proclaiming the public theology that formed part of the ending of slavery. Of course, it didn't happen just because of the public theology, but the public theology was a part of it and had influence. But that, of course, was a long time ago when we lived in a much more religious world than we do now. How does public theology help now? Well, there are various ways. One is Max Stackhouse, again, talks about the communication to national government and international governmental vehicles through civil society, that we can bring our public theology to civil society and they can see the worth of it whether or not they're religious, and then they carry that to the United Nations. So Catholic social teaching, in fact, has done that, has made a pretty good case for its perspective, and some of its tenets have been used by civil society internationally. Daniel Grudy has a different perspective, and also Hunter. shares Daniel Grady's perspective, which is that it is the discipleship of individual leaders and congregations that actually sort of seeps into the larger society and makes a difference. Of course, King actually spoke to the public, and so did Wilberforce. So there is this role that public theology has in impacting culture. And then, of course, public theology, as in the case of both Dr. King and Mr. Wilberforce, can be used to support activism, which is, of course, also what we saw with Cheer Fund. So I do look forward to the discussion this week. I am going to be asking you to think a little bit about what would you see as the most important elements of a public theology, and then how would you get that across to people in a way that would be effective. Thank you.